So global delivery mostly supports application development work, but it's starting to change. And I mentioned previously about how vendors are starting to explore some of the business innovation that exists in different countries. And they're even pushing downwards from the application layer into the infrastructure as well. And you're starting to see remote infrastructure management, remote monitoring, tools and methodologies. Those are the sorts of services which are emerging as well through the global delivery model. Now, it's mostly about India, but there's no surprise that India doesn't actually work for for a lot of companies, I should say. This is some of the satisfaction ratings we took. We actually asked our clients, we said, well, how satisfied are you with your decision to use a third party for offshore services? And no surprise there, in the UK, the levels of dissatisfaction are relatively low. Levels of dissatisfaction are relatively low. When you get to France and to Germany, it's a different story. So low cost from India does work, but in my mind, I think what companies need to do is try and balance the risk, try and figure out ways in which they can hedge themselves against some of the problems that India can actually create for them. And in Europe, in the UK, in France and Germany, you're seeing new blended approaches to global delivery, where you'll have a piece from India, a piece near shore delivered, in a service delivery hub, maybe in Poland, maybe in the Czech Republic, maybe in Spain, and then some onshore resources that the vendor has landed into your program management office, or the vendor has recruited locally in their own office. So a lot of these sourcing engagements which I track aren't actually all India. They actually comprise a blend between nearshore, offshore, and on-site. And in many ways, I think that protects customers, because it protects some of the issues around language, around culture, and around the documentation that can actually emerge. So, one of the reasons why firms move near shore to solve those offshore issues is precisely about the risk. India does have its problems. Now, there is attrition in India, there is wage inflation, there are skill shortages, even in a recession. Now, some of that heat has started to dissipate, I have to say. So some of the attrition levels we were tracking a year ago, 40, 50% in some of the projects that we were being brought in on, that started to subside a little bit. However, I still maintain that attrition, wage inflation, skill shortages are a problem in India. And I even think the way the Indian market is starting to move, they're starting to look at different localities, starting to turn their delivery or sort of sales engine to other areas around the world, namely the Middle East, and namely into China. So I still think rising attrition, wage inflation, skill shortage will be a problem, but those Indian rates really are starting to lose their shine in many ways. Now, I wrote a paper for the valueshore team, and in that paper I had to figure out, well, really, what are the problems with India? And I interviewed over 20 customers who weren't pre-selected. They were just customers we wanted to interview to understand their impressions of offshore. And some of the insights they were telling me were really rather interesting. Some of the issues regarding what they paid and what they got. I remember one UK retailer telling me that one offshore developer in India costs a third of what he pays in the UK. Yet, the quality of the work he got was a third of the quality of the work he got in the UK. So he was trying to figure out, well, should I just do this stuff in the UK rather than send it offshore, because the quality versus cost doesn't match up. And I think this is one of the problems you find the more aggressively you leverage offshore resources. You get higher churn in the accounts, you get less senior people put on the deals, and that can all create risk in terms of the way you actually want to run these projects. And just a really interesting story here, if you allow me. But we did some really interesting audit work with an auditor. Funnily enough, we did some work with an auditor that wanted to figure out, well, the rates they were being charged on their rate card, were those the rates that the vendor had actually supplied? And what they found was, when they went through the books, went through the timesheets, they found that the vendor had been supplying less qualified people, level 2 instead of level 4, and they won something in the region of £1.5 million back in overcharged accounts from the vendor. Now, that just gives you an idea of how process-centric you need to be on this stuff, how you actually need to monitor this stuff and figure out, you're getting what you're paying for. So those Indian rates are losing their shine. Customer issues challenge effective communication. It really is about language and the way in which cultures interface with one another. Language for me isn't so much of a problem because I think a lot of standardization in technology does rely on English language. But I think the culture thing is really, really critical. And when you have two cultures interfacing to each other, which are from very different backgrounds, you often get problems. And that's when the program management office has to be top-notch, has to be run, the best it can be run. And, the problem with the culture is you get some problems with service quality. And when you get poor service quality, your stakeholders, the stakeholders you serve internally within your business, tend to complain and tend to say, we don't want to go offshore, we want to go nearshore, or we want to go onshore. Now the problem is when your stakeholders tell you this, what you need to do is try and play out, well, this is what the costs are going to be if you do go nearshore. Maybe we need some halfway house offshore between nearshore, or some blend that marries the three different models together. Those aggressive blends that I talked about, when you really fully leverage offshore, okay, you may reduce your rates by 60%, 70%, but the problem is they create a heck of a lot of risk within your company. And I've tried to map out what those risks could actually be. Those risks from time zones, from the infrastructure, from the governance, from the actual physical distance, which actually prevents real-time collaboration in the way that you actually work with your vendor. Those external risks can really, really have an impact on how you run things internally. And I've tried to call out some of the maturity points you might want to test yourself against, because I think the most mature organizations really can go aggressively offshore. But the less mature organizations, and there's about 80% of organizations are actually at that point, can't actually do it because they don't have the maturity of governance, they don't have the effective management. They may even have problems in actually crafting, rigorous service level agreements or rigorous specifications for project work. I mean, these are the sort of aspects I would encourage you to try and figure out what you have internally within your business to try and figure out where it is or how aggressively you can offshore. And the point I'm trying to make here is if you feel you're relatively weak at some of this, then you do need to think about a different model here, a different model that blends nearshore with offshore rather than go aggressively to the offshore model.